Purim Sameach, Happy Purim. This past Shabbat was called Shabbat Zachor, the Shabbat right before Purim. There are moments in Jewish time when memory becomes sacred work. Parashat Zachor calls us to remember more than just history, but to remember danger, to remember that forces of destruction do not disappear simply because time passes. They remain in the background of history, waiting for moments of weakness, of moments of division, moments when communities forget who they are. But it's also to remember hope. Purim is one of those sacred paradoxical moments. On the surface, Purim is a holiday of joy, costumes, music, celebration. But beneath the celebration lies one of the deepest spiritual teachings of Jewish mysticism. Purim is not only about what happened in Persia long ago. Purim is about what is always happening in human history. It is about the struggle between forces of chaos and forces of renewal, between visibility and hiddenness. The Kabbalists taught that Purim is a moment when something cosmic shifts in the spiritual world. They taught that during exile, God's presence in the world is experienced as hiding from us. The idea is rooted in the Torah itself. In Deuteronomy, God warns, quote, "And I will surely hide my face on that day," end of quote. In Hebrew, it's Haster Astir Panai. After the destruction of the temple and throughout exile, our sages understood this not as abandonment, but as concealment. It did not mean that God ceased to care, but that the divine providence is no longer obvious. It becomes something we must search for. We have to interpret it, and sometimes struggle to trust. Some call it the eclipse of the divine. It's when history feels random, when power seems to belong to violence, to political domination, to forces that appear unstoppable. In mystical language, this condition is described as a kind of spiritual sleep. God does not disappear, but it feels like God's presence becomes quiet, subtle, and working through hidden channels of survival, resistance, and moral courage. The world continues, but without obvious revelation. The Zohar also describes archetypal forces of chaos and violence that constantly reappear in our history. These forces represent social fragmentation, fanaticism, violence, and dehumanization. The tradition connects these forces to Amalek, the biblical symbol of moral chaos and predatory violence. Amalek, he represents the enemy who attacks the vulnerable, who attacks when people are tired, who attacks when communities forget to stand together. Amalek and his descendant Haman symbolize a recurring pattern in history, which is the weaponization of power against the vulnerable. They represent a spiritual pathology. And although evil begins in the human heart, it rarely stays there. It organizes itself, it builds narratives, it drafts decrees, it turns into policy, gains legitimacy through institutions, spreads through propaganda, and then becomes so culturally accepted that ordinary people participate in it without reflection. This is why Parashat Zachor is read before Purim. We are commanded to remember that hatred always returns, not always in the same language, not always in the same political ideology. Sometimes it comes from the right, sometimes from the left, sometimes through nationalism, sometimes through radicalism or economic anxiety. Sometimes it comes through social polarization. Zachor, remember, memory is about being vigilant. The mystics described exile as a state in which higher intellectual and spiritual energies withdraw from visible history. The world feels coarse and reactive. It feels fragmented. But during Purim, those energies awaken again and something subtle shifts. This means that concealment is not the end of the story. It means that even in periods when moral clarity seems dim, when public discourse is very harsh, when communities feel anxious or divided, there are deeper currents of goodness waiting to surface. The awakening of Purim is the awakening of courage within ordinary people. It is the reminder that history can pivot on a single act of integrity. Mordechai and Esther understood that there are moments when spiritual clarity must enter the realm of political action. Mordechai embodied moral integrity, ethical leadership, and Esther moved from hiddenness to courageous responsibility, teaching that in times of crisis, silence is complicity and stepping into history becomes a sacred duty. Purim, therefore, moves from mysticism to responsibility. This past week, we hosted in our synagogue a dialogue with civic leaders and representatives through the Jewish Community Relations Council under the sponsors of the Federation. It was their legislative breakfast. Jewish survival cannot be achieved only through prayer. It requires relationship, public advocacy, and moral partnership with a broader society. Just like Queen Esther and Mordechai, who understood the political structures of their time and used access wisely, we are also called to participate in civic life with integrity. Faith and social responsibility belong together. We need to advocate with these senators and representatives for security, for dignity, for the vulnerable, and for ourselves. To do so is to refuse normalization of Amalek's cruelty. It is to insist that the goodness that is hiding can be made visible through policy, partnership, and action. The 4 commandments of Purim are spiritual practices that awaken goodness in the world. Through the reading of the Megillah, we cultivate memory as resistance and moral vigilance. Through Mishloach Manot, sending gifts to friends, we repair community with generosity. Through Matanot Le'Evyonim, gifts to the poor, we ensure that joy becomes responsibility. And through festive gathering, we affirm life, even in a world where God seems hidden. The forces of destruction do not have the final word. Purim teaches that even when God seems hidden, goodness is not absent. It emerges through human courage, through leadership, and the solidarity of the community. We remember Amalek, and in that remembering, we choose to become visible agents of love and justice. I wish everybody a very happy Purim.